The moment Maria Barrett stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, every soul on the main street could see that something had gone terribly wrong long before she ever boarded that coach. Her right arm hung at an unnatural angle, wrapped in a makeshift sling fashioned from what appeared to be a torn petticoat, the fabric yellowed with dust and spotted with dried blood at the edges. Her jaw was set so rigid and tight that even the smallest movement of her lips seemed to cost her something, and her dark eyes, wide and startlingly beautiful beneath the shadow of her travel bonnet, swept the street with the kind of wariness that belonged to an animal that had learned the hard way what it meant to trust. She was 24 years old. She was supposed to be a bride. Stephen Garrett stood at the edge of the wooden sidewalk outside the post office with a handwritten sign that his neighbor, old Pete Haskell, had teased him mercilessly for making. The sign read simply, "Miss Maria Barrett, welcome." He had used his best handwriting, which was not particularly good, and he had borrowed a piece of blue ribbon from the dry goods store to tie around the post office rail nearby, because someone had told him once that women appreciated small gestures. He did not know if that was true. He had never been married before. Stephen was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and hands roughened from years of working a cattle ranch 12 miles southeast of town. He had dark blonde hair that needed a cut badly and gray eyes that people in Caldwell sometimes described as thoughtful. He was not a man given to speeches or grand romantic declarations. He had written to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis with the awkward honesty of a man who knew himself well. "I am not wealthy, but I am steady. I own land and cattle, and I mean to build something lasting. I want a partner, not a servant. I will be kind." Maria had written back. She had written 3 letters in total before they agreed to the arrangement, and her letters were precise and intelligent and occasionally funny in a dry way that surprised him. She wrote about books she had read and about her skill with a garden, and about her late mother's recipe for apple preserves, which she claimed was the finest in all of Missouri. She wrote about wanting a fresh start in the kind of tone that suggested the start she was leaving behind had not been fresh at all. He had read between those lines carefully and said nothing about what he suspected. He was not the sort of man who pried. But now she stood before him in the Kansas dust with a broken arm and a jaw locked so tight it seemed bolted shut, and he watched her eyes find the sign he was holding, and he watched something in her face shift, not quite relief, not quite hope, but something cautious and uncertain moving underneath those two things, trying to decide whether to show itself. He walked toward her. He did not ask what happened to her arm. He did not ask why she looked like a woman who had been running from something, or why there was a faint yellow-green bruise at the corner of her left cheekbone that her bonnet brim barely concealed. He simply took the traveling bag from her left hand, the one that worked, and he said, "Miss Barrett, I'm Stephen Garrett. You must be tired. There's a hotel room arranged for you tonight, and I've got a wagon just down the street." She stared at him for a long moment. Her jaw worked slightly, the muscles tightening and releasing as though she was testing whether words would come out. They did not right away, but she nodded. He did not fill the silence with nervous chatter. He simply walked beside her toward the wagon, matching his pace to hers, and when they reached the step up to the boardwalk and she hesitated because negotiating a step while carrying nothing and having only one functional arm was still difficult, he offered his arm without comment and waited for her to take it. She took it. The hotel in Caldwell was a modest 2-story affair called the Frontier House, run by a woman named Hetty Bloom, who had seen enough of the world to know when a woman needed quiet and when she needed fussing over, and who was wise enough to distinguish between the two. Hetty took one look at Maria and announced that supper would be brought up to the room rather than taken in the dining area, and that there was a bathtub available for a reasonable fee, and that she had liniment and fresh bandaging supplies if they were needed. "Thank you," Maria said, and it was the first time Stephen heard her voice clearly. It came out rough and slightly thickened, the jaw still resistant, but the voice itself was low and measured, and carried the faint accent of a woman raised in the middle of Missouri, the kind of voice that suggested both good schooling and hard experience. He left her at the foot of the stairs with the simple instruction that he would return in the morning at 9 o'clock, and that there was absolutely no obligation, and that if she had any need before then, the livery man down the street, a trustworthy soul named Cal Briggs, would know how to find him. She stood on the bottom stair and looked at him with those dark, careful eyes. "You have not asked me anything," she said. The words came out slowly, each one deliberate, as though speaking was something she was doing cautiously around the tightness in her jaw. "No," he agreed. "Most men would have asked. I expect they would." Another silence. She gripped the stair rail with her left hand, and he could see the effort it cost her to hold herself upright after what must have been a brutal journey. "I will tell you everything," she said. "Not tonight, but I will tell you." "All right," he said, and he meant it simply, without pressure or impatience, and she seemed to understand that because some of the rigid holding in her shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly downward. He walked back to his wagon in the early evening dark and drove the 12 miles back to his ranch under a sky so full of stars that it seemed almost unreasonable, thinking about a woman with careful eyes and a broken arm, and the kind of courage it took to board a stagecoach headed toward a stranger after whatever had clearly happened to her. He thought about her all night. In the morning he was up before dawn, which was not unusual for him. He fed his horses, checked on the cattle that were grazing in the south pasture, and then did something he had not done since his mother's annual Easter visits, which was to actually clean the house with genuine attention. He swept and mopped and aired the curtains and placed a small jar of wildflowers, yellow ones, because they grew along the fence line and were the only option on the kitchen table. He stood back and looked at the kitchen and thought it was decent enough. Not elegant, but decent. His nearest neighbor, a widow woman named Clara Hicks, who farmed 20 acres to the west of his property, and who had been the one to suggest the matrimonial agency to him in the first place, arrived mid-morning with a covered dish of corn bread and a pointed look. Clara was 53 and had buried a husband and raised 2 sons to adulthood and had about as much patience for nonsense as a rattlesnake had for cold weather. "Well," she said, "she arrived. She arrived." Clara set the corn bread on the table and noticed the wildflowers. She said nothing about them, but the corners of her mouth moved. "How is she?" Stephen leaned in the kitchen doorway and considered how to answer. "She's had a hard road," he said. Clara's expression flattened into something quiet and serious. She had seen hard roads before. She had lived one. "You be patient with her," she said. "I intend to." "Patient like actually patient," Clara said. "Not just quiet and waiting. Actually patient. There's a difference." He drove back into Caldwell at 5 minutes to 9, which in his experience was the appropriate time to demonstrate that you were not late without demonstrating that you were anxious, though in truth he was some of both. Maria was already downstairs in the hotel lobby, sitting very straight in one of the wooden chairs near the window with her traveling bag at her feet and her arm still in its sling, wearing a clean dress dark blue, very plain, that she must have changed into from her bag. She had done something to arrange her dark hair more neatly than the day before, and the bruise on her cheek was still visible, but she had made no attempt to hide it with anything, which told him something about her character that he filed away quietly. He took her to breakfast at the only decent eating establishment in Caldwell, which was a small lunch counter run by a Chinese man named Henry Lum, who had come west with the railroad and stayed, and who made biscuits that people in 3 counties talked about. Henry did not stare at Maria's arm or her bruise. He brought coffee and biscuits and a plate of eggs, and then retreated with the dignified discretion of a man who had learned that minding your own business was both a virtue and a survival skill. Maria ate carefully, using only her left hand, cutting small pieces and taking measured bites in a way that suggested the jaw was still causing her pain. He did not comment on it. He talked instead about the ranch, described the land, the layout of the house, the number of cattle he currently ran, the way the creek behaved in spring and fall, the small garden on the south side of the house that had gone mostly to weeds because he had no talent for growing things and freely admitted it. She listened. She asked questions, sharp, practical questions about water rights and weather patterns and the nearest school, which was in a town called Medford, 8 miles north. The questions told him she was already mapping the place in her mind, already thinking about what a life there might look like, and he was glad of it. Then she set down her fork with quiet precision and looked at him directly and said, "I should tell you about my arm." He met her eyes and said, "Only if you want to." "I told you I would." A pause. She looked out the window at the main street where a man was loading barrels onto a cart, and 2 women in good bonnets were discussing something outside the milliner's. His name was Douglas Crane. He was my employer in St. Louis. I was a seamstress in his shop. She stopped, started again. He was not a good man. Stephen kept his expression steady and open. He drank his coffee. "He did not want me to leave," she continued. "When the agency's letter came and I told him I was going, he was not pleased." Her voice stayed level, but he could hear the effort behind that levelness, the way you could hear a river's force by watching how smooth the surface ran. "He broke my arm 3 days before I was to leave. He thought it would stop me." Stephen set down his cup very carefully. "It did not stop me," Maria said, and there was something in those 5 words that was more than a statement of fact. It was a declaration. It was the whole of her character in a single sentence. He looked at her across the table in Henry Lum's lunch counter in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, and he understood that this woman sitting across from him was one of the most remarkable people he had ever encountered. He did not say that yet. It was too early, and it would have sounded like flattery, and he did not think she needed flattery. He thought she needed steadiness. "What happened to your jaw?" he asked, and the question came out quietly, without urgency, because it had been sitting in his mind since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach, and he felt she had opened the door to it now. She touched the line of her jaw with the fingers of her left hand. "He struck me across the face as I was leaving. I believe the jaw is not broken, just very unhappy." A ghost of something almost like dark humor moved across her face. The doctor in St. Louis looked at the arm. "He said it would heal correctly if kept still. I have been keeping it still for 9 days. "There's a doctor in Medford," Stephen said. "Good man. We can go when you're ready." "Thank you," she said. A long quiet settled between them, but it was a different quiet than the one from the night before. That one had been cautious and provisional. This one had more air in it. "I will understand," she said carefully, "if this changes things for you. If you had rather, it doesn't change things," he said, and he said it without hesitation because it was true. "Not in the way you mean." She studied him. She had the kind of dark brown eyes that seemed to take in more than they gave away. Which he was beginning to understand was how she had survived being the kind of person she was in circumstances that had been unkind to her. "You are a very unusual man, Mr. Garrett," she said. "Stephen," he said. "Stephen," she repeated, and it was the first time she said his name, and the particular quality of her low voice saying it did something small and irreversible somewhere in the region of his chest. He drove her out to the ranch that afternoon. Not to stay, she would stay at the frontier house for a few more days while they figured out the appropriate arrangements, because he was a man who took both propriety and her comfort seriously, but to see the place. He wanted her to see it with daylight full on it, not on some future morning when the decision was already made. The drive out was 12 miles of Kansas grassland in late April, which meant the world was all green and gold and enormous sky, with the occasional cottonwood along the creek beds and the distant smudge of hills to the west. Maria sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the land go by with an expression of focused attention, as if she was reading a book in a language she was still learning. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said after a while. "The sky or the land?" she considered. "Both." "But I meant the sky." She tipped her head back slightly. "In St. Louis the buildings eat most of it. Does it bother you, the openness?" "No," she said, and she sounded almost surprised by her own answer. "No, I think I might need it." The ranch itself was modest by the standards of the bigger cattle operations in the region, but it was solid and well-tended in all the ways that mattered. The house was a two-room structure with a kitchen and a main room, and a small bedroom added on the back that he had built himself 2 years prior when he first started thinking about the future in earnest. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a well with a good pump, and the south garden which was, as he had warned her, considerably weedy. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around the room, and then she looked at the jar of yellow wildflowers on the table, and a small smile crossed her face, barely there but genuine. "I see you have flowers," she said. "They were available," he said. She turned and looked at him, and the small smile was still there, tucked at the corners of her mouth. "Thank you, Stephen." He showed her the rest of the property, and she asked practical questions about all of it, walking beside him with her arm in its sling and her eyes taking everything in. When they came to the south garden, she crouched down with surprising ease given her injury, using her left hand to pull aside some of the larger weeds, examining the soil beneath. "This is good soil," she said. "Heavy clay but workable. You could grow most things here with the right amendments. I don't know the first thing about it." "I do," she said simply and stood up. "My mother taught me. She had a kitchen garden my whole childhood, everything you would want." It was the first time she had mentioned her mother since the letters, and he remembered what she had written in the second one, that her mother had passed when Maria was 16 and that her father had followed 2 years later, and that she had been largely on her own since 18. 8 years of being entirely on her own, in a city, working a trade, surviving a man like Douglas Crane. He did not say any of this, but he held it. On the drive back to Caldwell she was quieter, and it was the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that came after something real had happened. The sun was getting low and painting the grassland in shades of amber and copper, and she had turned her face slightly toward it in a way that seemed unconscious, like a plant orienting toward light. He walked her to the door of the frontier house, and she paused on the step and turned to look at him. The evening light was good on her face even with the bruise, and her dark eyes were softer than they had been when she stepped off the stagecoach, softer and a little warmer, though still careful. "I think," she said, "that I would like to stay." He felt something in his chest settle, something that had been subtly coiled for months without his full awareness. "I'm glad of it," he said. "We should speak to the minister," she said, very practically. "I'll arrange it for Saturday if that suits." "Saturday suits," she said. Then she went inside, and he stood for a moment in the warm evening air of Caldwell's Main Street, listening to the distant sounds of the town winding down, a dog barking, someone playing a fiddle somewhere, the creak of a sign in the light evening wind, and he thought that the world was a very strange and occasionally merciful place. The days between Tuesday and Saturday were not idle ones. Wednesday morning, he drove Maria to Medford to see Dr. Franklin Hayes, who was a neat, methodical man of 50 with wire spectacles and the calming manner of someone who had seen enough frontier injuries to be unshockable. He examined Maria's arm with careful hands and said that whoever had said it initially, she had paid a St. Louis doctor with her own savings, had done a competent job, and that with proper splinting and 4 to 6 weeks of rest it would heal clean. He fashioned a proper splint out of thin cedar boards and clean muslin bandaging, and gave her a small bottle of willow bark extract for the pain. Then he examined her jaw, pressing gently along the joint with practiced fingers while Maria sat absolutely still and white-lipped, and told her it was severely bruised but not broken, that the muscles and tendons around the joint had been traumatized, and that she should eat soft foods for another 2 weeks, and that the stiffness would gradually ease. He asked no prying questions about how either injury had been sustained. He said, "You have come a long way, Miss Barrett," in a tone that acknowledged more than the literal miles, and left it at that. On the drive back from Medford, Maria was quiet for a while and then said, "I should write to the agency to inform them the arrangement is going forward." "I can help with that if you need," Stephen said. "I have paper and ink at the house." "I'm left-handed," she said, with a slight note of satisfaction. "The right arm being broken is at least a small convenience." He laughed. It came out surprised, which surprised him, because it was not the sort of thing he usually laughed at without warning. She glanced at him with an expression that was also slightly surprised, as though she had not been certain her small, dark joke would land. And then she smiled, a fuller one than the tucked corner version from the day before, showing her teeth briefly, and the whole quality of the afternoon shifted. Thursday, he introduced her to Clara Hicks. Clara lived up to her reputation for directness, but she also had a warm practicality that showed itself in the fact that she arrived at the farmhouse fence on horseback with a covered basket over one arm containing preserved peaches, a wedge of hard cheese, and a small potted rosemary plant. She assessed Maria in approximately 30 seconds and then said, "You'll do," which from Clara was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Maria, for her part, looked at Clara with the same measuring intelligence she turned on everything and then said, "That is a very fine horse." Clara blinked and then smiled with genuine pleasure, because the horse, a steel-gray mare named Josephine, was indeed fine, and most people were too intimidated by Clara to notice anything so specific. "She is," Clara said. "You ride?" "I used to," Maria said. "Before the city." "Well then," Clara said, as if this settled everything. They sat in the kitchen and talked for an hour, and Stephen made coffee badly and Clara corrected him, and Maria watched this exchange with quiet amusement. Clara asked practical questions about Maria's skills and background with the frank efficiency of a woman doing a mental inventory, and Maria answered with the straightforward candor that Stephen was coming to recognize as one of her defining qualities. When Clara left, she pulled Stephen aside for approximately 10 seconds at the fence and said, very quietly, "She's a good woman, Stephen. You hold on to that." "I know," he said. Thursday evening, he rode out to check on the south pasture cattle, and sat on his horse on a small rise and watched the sun go down over his land, and thought about how different it looked to him now. Not because anything had changed in the grass or the sky or the distant line of hills, but because for the first time in a long while he could see it whole, the way you could only really see a place once you had someone specific to share it with. Friday, which was the day before the wedding, Maria came out to the ranch for the second time, brought by the livery man Cal Briggs, who had been running people back and forth, and asking no questions about any of it in the most diplomatically incurious way possible. She came to look at the garden again, she said. But she also came, Stephen understood, because the hotel was small and the town was not hers yet, and there was something about the ranch, something in the scale of it and the quiet of it, that she was already beginning to feel at ease in. He watched her work in the garden for 2 hours, left-handed and careful with her splinted arm, pulling weeds and testing soil and making small authoritative pronouncements about what would grow and what would not and where the light fell. She had put on an apron she had found on the kitchen peg and rolled up her left sleeve, and she was entirely absorbed in the work, her forehead furrowed in concentration, and she was talking to him over her shoulder as she worked, a running commentary on plants and soil and the orientation of the garden beds. And he was sitting on the garden fence post listening and responding where he could, and watching her with the full quiet attention of a man who was beginning to understand that he was in serious trouble of falling in love. Not the tumbling theatrical kind, the other kind. The kind that moved in steadily like weather changing, like the slow certain rising of water, irresistible and quiet and already half finished before you noticed it. She stopped and looked at the corner of the garden where there was a tangle of what she had identified as persistent bindweed, very difficult to remove, and she put her good left hand on her hip and sighed with real frustration. "This is going to be a battle," she said. "I'll help." She looked at him. She looked at his hands, the big Ranchuffin hands that he was somewhat aware were not built for delicate garden work. "Do you know anything about weeding?" "I know about pulling things out by the root," he said. "I assume the principle is similar." She stared at him for a moment and then she laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the first one he had heard from her, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in a very long time. It transformed her face completely. The careful wariness dropped away entirely for just that moment, and she was simply herself, laughing, and it was a revelation. "That is approximately the principle, yes," she said, when the laughter settled. She looked at him with those dark eyes, soft now in the afternoon light, and she was smiling still, and he held onto the image of it with both hands. That evening, sitting on the porch steps while the light went out of the sky, she told him more. He had not asked. She had simply begun talking, the way water finds a course when the ground is ready for it, and he listened. She told him about growing up in Hannibal, Missouri, on the Mississippi, in a household that had been decent and warm until it wasn't, and then good again when her mother's garden was in bloom. She told him about the years in St. Louis, the seamstress work, the loneliness of being a young woman alone in a city with no family left, the way you built a kind of armor out of competence because competence was the only protection available to you. She told him about Douglas Crane in the measured, controlled way of a woman who had spent time organizing those memories into a shape she could carry without being destroyed by them. He had been her employer for 3 years. He had been charming at first, in the predatory way that certain men were charming when they wanted something. When she had begun to understand what he was, she had kept her distance carefully and professionally. When the agency's letter had come, she had felt for the first time in a long time that she could see a way forward that was entirely her own. Crane had not taken it well. He had considered her, she said quietly, to be a kind of possession. Something that stayed because he willed it to stay. Her refusal to be possessed had made him violent. "I was not afraid of him," she said. It came out flat and factual. "I was angry. There is a difference. Fear makes you freeze. Anger makes you move." She paused. "So I moved." Stephen was quiet for a moment. The sky overhead was fully dark now, and the stars were coming out in their thousands, filling the immense Kansas sky from one edge to the other. Somewhere in the grass a cricket was singing. "He broke your arm and you got on the stagecoach anyway," he said. "Yes, with your bag already packed. I had packed it 4 days before. I was not going to unpack it." He looked at her in the starlight, this woman sitting 2 feet away from him on the porch steps of the house that was going to be her house tomorrow, and he thought, "I am going to spend my whole life being astonished by you, and I do not mind that at all." He did not say this. It was too much for a porch step in starlight before the wedding, but he filed it away for a future moment when it would fit better. What he said instead was, "You're safe here." She looked at him, and the expression on her face was complex and layered, and had something in it that was almost grief. Not grief exactly, but the emotional equivalent of a long-held muscle finally being allowed to release. "I know," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. "I think that is what frightened me most about arriving, that it might actually be true." He did not entirely follow this, but he thought he understood it enough. The way certain fears run deepest precisely when the thing you're afraid to lose is finally within reach. "It's true," he said simply. She nodded once. Then she looked back up at the stars. They sat there for another half hour in the good dark quiet, not talking, just existing in the same space, and it was the most comfortable silence Stephen Garrett had sat in for years. The wedding on Saturday morning was small by design, and by the particular circumstances. Though Caldwell being the kind of town it was, small still meant approximately 20 people materializing in and around the white-painted church on Chestnut Street, as if by magnetic attraction. Reverend Thomas Albright performed the ceremony with quiet efficiency and some genuine warmth. He was a young minister, only 30, recently arrived from Ohio, and he had the good sense not to make any remarks about Maria's splinted arm or to pace the ceremony so quickly that it felt cursory. He read the traditional words at a measured pace and seemed to mean them. Clara Hicks stood at Maria's side, which was not strictly traditional but was entirely right. She had also, it emerged on the morning of the wedding, driven over to the frontier house at 7 in the morning with a dress she had made 2 years prior and never worn, which was of a deep blue-gray wool challis, simple and well-cut, and which fit Maria nearly perfectly with 2 small adjustments that Clara had made in 40 minutes with a needle and thread, and the competent speed of a woman who had been sewing since childhood. Maria wore it with her splinted arm resting in its sling across her chest, and she had arranged her dark hair up with a few small white prairie flowers tucked into it, and she looked, Stephen thought when he saw her walking down the church aisle on Clara's arm, like something that had been carved out of the morning itself. He stood at the front of the church in his good suit, which was brown wool and which he had pressed the night before with a flat iron heated on the stove, and when she reached him and they turned to face each other, her dark eyes met his gray ones, and what passed between them in that moment was not the flowery romantic electricity of novels, but something more grounded and more real. A recognition, a mutual decision. This is right pronounced silently and certainly between 2 people who had both thought about it carefully and chosen it with their eyes open. "I do," she said, when the moment came, in her measured, low voice, and the jaw was still a little stiff, but the words came out clear and sure. "I do," he said. He put the ring on her left hand rather than her right because her right was splinted, and the Reverend adapted smoothly and said not a word about it. And when Stephen was told he could kiss his bride, he did so with appropriate gentleness, just the lightest press of his lips to hers, and she let out a small quiet breath against his mouth that felt like the last of something releasing. The small reception was held in the churchyard and featured 3 kinds of pie, courtesy of Hetty Bloom from the hotel, and the corn-bread Clara had been producing for 3 days running, and a very reasonable quantity of whiskey poured by Cal Briggs from a bottle he had brought for toasting purposes, and which was somewhat more frequently consulted than strictly required. Pete Haskell played the fiddle reasonably well. Henry Lum from the lunch counter appeared at the edge of the gathering with a wrapped gift of tea and preserved ginger, and offered his congratulations with quiet dignity. Maria moved through the small gathering with Stephen at her side, and he watched her talk to people, to Clara and Hetty and the Reverend and Pete, and the handful of other ranch wives and townspeople who had appeared, and he watched the careful alertness in her eyes gradually loosen and warm as she went, as she discovered that these were ordinary people being ordinarily kind, and that nothing was required of her here except to be present. By early afternoon, they were driving out to the ranch together in Stephen's wagon, with Maria's traveling bag and a wedding gift of kitchen goods from Clara stacked in the back, and the Kansas sky was high and blue and completely magnificent overhead, and they were married. The first weeks were a careful and sweet navigation of the ordinary. 2 people learning the particular rhythms of another person's presence, where they stood in the kitchen, how they took their coffee, what they needed in the morning before they were ready for conversation, what sounds they made moving through the house at night. Maria's jaw loosened steadily over the first 2 weeks, the tightness easing day by day as the inflammation receded, until by the end of the 3rd week she was eating normally and talking without the measured, careful quality she had been managing around the pain. When this happened, Stephen discovered that her natural speaking voice, unfettered by injury, was warm and expressive and capable of a dry, precise humor that caught him off guard regularly, and which he loved without reservation. Her arm was kept still and splinted through the first 4 weeks, which was a source of considerable frustration for her, not because of the pain. She was stoic about pain in a way that he suspected had been learned necessity, but because she wanted to work, and working with one hand limited her in ways she found profoundly annoying. She found ways around it with a relentlessness that amused and impressed him. She learned to do most kitchen tasks one-handed with a speed and dexterity that suggested her left hand had always been naturally capable. She directed Stephen in the garden with precise instructions while he provided the 2-armed labor, and the south garden began to take on an ordered, well-attended quality that was entirely due to her knowledge and his willingness. He was a good student in the garden. He was willing and attentive, and completely unashamed to admit when he did not know something, which she told him one evening was rarer than he might think. "Most men," she said, pulling a weed from around the base of a young bean plant with her left hand, "do not enjoy being instructed by a woman." "That seems like their loss," he said mildly. She looked at him sideways. "It is," she agreed. There was the matter, also, of the house itself. Maria had a clear eye for domestic organization and an absolute willingness to rearrange things that were not working, combined with the good grace to ask rather than simply do it because it was his house before it was hers. She would say things like, "I was thinking the preserving shelf might work better against the south wall. Would that bother you?" And he would say no, it would not bother him, and she would rearrange the shelf with quiet efficiency, and it would be better. And this happened several times with various pieces of furniture and domestic arrangements, and each small adjustment made the house feel less like a ranch house and more like a home. He noticed this and was glad of it without knowing exactly how to say so. What he did instead was small things. He made sure there was always coffee hot when she woke. He found, on a trip to Medford in early May, a slim volume of collected verse in the dry goods store, slightly battered, half its price, and he left it on the kitchen table without comment and said nothing about it when she picked it up that evening, and went very still for a moment before looking across the room at him with an expression that was careful and touched and slightly undone. He patched the shed door that had been banging in the wind because she had mentioned twice that the sound bothered her sleep, and then said nothing about having done it. One evening in the second week she looked up from some mending she was doing left-handed with considerable skill and said out of nowhere, "Tell me about your family." He was repairing a bridle at the other side of the kitchen table, and he considered the question honestly. "My father ran a cattle operation in Texas," he said. "Not so different from this. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married him. She died of fever when I was 18. My father followed 4 years later. He wasn't sick. He was just done, I think. He missed her too much to keep going." Maria put down the mending and looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "That is a lonely story," she said. "I had brothers and sisters, 2 of each. They scattered after one sister is in Denver, one brother in California. We write sometimes. But you stayed." "I wanted land," he said. "Real land that was mine. Texas didn't have room for me, so I came north." He paused. "I've been here 7 years. It's mine now, the way a place gets to be yours when you've worked it long enough." She looked around the kitchen, at the walls he had built and the table he had made and the window that looked out over the south garden where she was already growing things. "Yes," she said, "I understand that. Do you?" He was curious because she had come from a city, from a very different kind of relationship with place. "I understand it as something I want," she said, with that precise honesty of hers. "My mother had it with her garden, that absolute belonging to a piece of earth. I have not had a place long enough to have it yet, but I recognize it." He thought about this. "You'll have it here," he said. "Give it time." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and said, very quietly, "I think I already am." In the 5th week, Dr. Hayes came out from Medford. He made occasional rounds to the outlying ranches when time allowed, and examined Maria's arm with his careful hands and said it was healing well, cleaner than he had expected, and that she could begin careful use of it again. Nothing heavy, no strain, but the splint could come off. She received this news with a composure that lasted approximately until he was back on his horse and heading down the ranch road, at which point she held out her arm and flexed her fingers experimentally with an expression of such profound relief that Stephen laughed, and she shot him a warning look and then laughed too. She was considerably more mobile with 2 arms. This was both practically useful and, he discovered, somewhat more physically distracting, in the honest way that a man noticing his wife was a beautiful woman was distracting. He had been careful and respectful of her space and history, and had not pressed anything she had not reached for herself, and she had been similarly thoughtful and deliberate about the distance between them, which had been slowly and voluntarily closing in small increments since the first day. That evening she was washing up at the kitchen basin, and she turned and found him closer than she had realized, and there was a moment's stillness between them, just a breath's worth of it, before she stepped into that proximity rather than out of it, and he put his arms around her carefully, with the right arm still somewhat tender, and she leaned her head against his chest and let herself be held. They stood like that for a while in the quiet kitchen with the sound of the wind moving through the grass outside, and he rested his chin against the top of her hair and felt her breathing slow and settle, and this small, ordinary intimacy was one of the finest things he had experienced in his adult life. "Stephen," she said into his chest. "Yes, I am glad I got on that stagecoach." He held her a little more carefully. "So am I," he said. "So am I." Summer came in hard and bright, and the ranch work intensified in the way it always did, and Maria was in the thick of it from the first week of June, which was when she decided that being a ranch wife meant being a ranch partner, and that she was not going to sit in the house while there was work to be done outside. She learned fast, with the same focused competence she applied to everything, and she and Stephen worked well together with the natural rhythm of two people who had similar ideas about efficiency and a shared tendency to communicate clearly and without drama. She was not afraid of the cattle, which he had half expected her to be, given the city years. She treated them with practical matter-of-fact respect, and they responded to it. She had a particular ease with the horses that emerged quickly once she was back on horseback. Clara had lent her the use of a calm bay gelding named Chester, and she rode with the naturalness of someone who had learned young and let years pass without practice, the skill returning cleanly once recalled. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the sky go colors, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they read. She had been through the volume of verse and pronounced 2/3 of it excellent and 1/3 mannered, and sometimes they simply sat in the good mutual quiet that had always been comfortable between them, right from the first night. She wrote letters. She wrote to the two siblings she had mentioned obliquely in her early letters to the agency, a younger brother named William who was in Kansas City, and a cousin she was close to, a woman named Ruth in Indiana. She had not written to them during the Crane years, she told Stephen one evening, because she had not wanted them to know how bad it was. "That is the particular cruelty of that kind of situation," she said, with the measured tone she used when discussing things that had cost her. "You hide it because you're ashamed of it, and in hiding it you lose the people who might have helped. It is very well designed to trap you. Are you going to tell them now?" "I am going to tell them I am well," she said. "I am going to tell them I am married, and that I have a garden and a disagreeable amount of livestock, and a husband who cannot grow anything, but apparently can grow good cattle." He looked at her. "Disagreeable amount of livestock. We have 38 head of cattle and 4 horses and 12 chickens and a dog," she said. "Rex," she looked at the large mixed-breed dog sleeping in an undignified heap in the corner, "who is charming but smells unfortunate." "Rex smells fine," Stephen said, with the reflexive loyalty of a man defending his dog. "Rex smells like a wet saddle blanket that has been left in a stream," Maria said pleasantly. Rex, who had no strong opinions about his own smell, thumped his tail once at the sound of his name and went back to sleep. The letter to her cousin Ruth came back in August with an envelope thicker than the original letter. Ruth was, it emerged, an eloquent correspondent. She wrote about Indiana, about her own small farm, about her children who were 7 and 10. She wrote about how worried she had been about Maria in the St. Louis years, when the letters had stopped coming regularly. She wrote that she was overjoyed that Maria had found something real and good, and she asked about Stephen in the particular intelligent way of someone who wanted to form an accurate picture. Maria read parts of the letter to Stephen at the kitchen table on a warm August evening, and he listened and thought about what it meant to Maria to have this, the reclamation of these ordinary connections. A cousin, a brother, a history that was hers and not Crane's to control. He thought about how much had been taken from her and how much she was now, quietly and steadily, taking back. Her brother William wrote in September, a shorter letter, young man terse, but with an unmistakable warmth underneath the brevity. He was 22, working in a dry goods warehouse. He was, apparently, considering whether the West might suit him. Maria read this letter and looked up at Stephen with a slightly raised eyebrow that was a question. "He's welcome any time," Stephen said immediately. "I could use a good hand, and I'd rather hire someone with reasons to work hard." Maria folded the letter carefully. "I will tell him that," she said, and there was something in her voice that was soft and old, the particular kind of emotion that came from the reclaiming of family. Summer turned to fall in the blaze and gold that the Kansas plains did extremely well, and the ranch settled into its autumn rhythms. The cattle drives to the market in Caldwell, the harvest of Maria's garden which had by September produced more than either of them could eat, and had led to a serious and pleasurable project of preserving and pickling and storing. The rows of jars on the new preserving shelf against the south wall, a source of quiet pride. The apple preserves, made from a small windfall apple tree Stephen had never paid much attention to at the edge of the east pasture, were indeed, as Maria had advertised in her very first letter, among the finest he had ever tasted. He told her so, and she looked pleased in the particular way she looked pleased when something lived up to the promise she had made for it. One October evening, sitting on the porch with the air carrying the first real edge of cold and the sunset doing something extraordinary with the clouds to the west, Maria said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. She had her hands around a coffee cup, and she was looking out at the horizon with an expression that was thoughtful and careful and faintly nervous, which was unusual for her. "All right," he said. "I was afraid," she said, "for a long time after I arrived that you would change. That the man who held a sign at the stagecoach and asked no questions would turn into someone different once there was no longer a reason to be careful with me." She stopped. "I know that is not a very complimentary thing to say to you." "It's honest," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "You are exactly who you were on that first day. You are better, actually, because I know you better, and every part of knowing you better it has only made the picture clearer and better." She stopped again. The sunset was doing extraordinary things to the sky. She turned and looked at him directly. "I love you," she said. "I wanted you to know that. Not because it is expected or required. Because it is true." He looked at her for a long moment in the October evening light. This woman sitting beside him, who had arrived broken-armed and jaw-locked and full of wary intelligence, and the particular indestructible courage of someone who had survived hard things with themselves intact, who had grown a garden and filled a house with warmth, and learned to trust him with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood exactly what trust was worth, who laughed at unexpected moments and had opinions about poetry and smelled good things on every breeze, and who was, without question, the finest thing that had happened in his 31 years. "I love you," he said. "I have for a while. I was waiting for the right time." Was this the right time? It appears to have been. She set down her coffee cup on the porch railing and she leaned across and kissed him, warmly and with purpose, the October wind moving through the grass around the house, the last of the sunset burning out in golds and pinks above the western hills. He kissed her back with his whole heart. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a hard one in Kansas, which was not unusual. The temperatures dropped in December to the kind of cold that made the ground ring underfoot, and the cattle needed extra care, and the horses needed the barn banked with additional hay. Stephen and Maria worked the hard season together the way they worked everything, with efficient good humor and a willingness to divide the labor intelligently and to trust each other's judgment. There were storms. There was one particularly bad blizzard in January that kept them housebound for 3 days, which was not hardship exactly, but it was close quarters, and the close quarters revealed a few edges and rough spots that were entirely normal in two people who were still learning each other. Maria had a particular vein of stubbornness about certain things, about being told rather than asked, about anything that felt like having her competence doubted, that flared twice during those 3 days over small things that were not really about the small things. And Stephen had a tendency to go quiet and withdrawing when he felt pressured or argued with, which she told him on the second evening, with her hands on her hips and her brown eyes direct and serious, was infuriating. "I understand why you do it," she said. "You've been alone a long time and being alone teaches you to go inward. But I am not alone and neither are you, and when you go somewhere I cannot follow it feels like—" She stopped. "It feels like being dismissed." He thought about this honestly. "That's not what I mean by it," he said. "I know what you mean by it. I am telling you what it does." He sat with this for a moment. "I'll try to stay present," he said. "Tell me when I'm doing it." "You're doing it right now," she said. He blinked, looked at her, and then laughed, a slightly rueful sound because she was right. He had been starting to go behind his own face. "All right," he said. "I'm back." "Good," she said, and the tension in her shoulders released and she sat down beside him and leaned against his arm. "You see, that was not so terrible." "It was not," he agreed. They navigated the winter's other difficulties with less friction and more warmth, the house being genuinely warm and close in the winter way of a well-built structure in cold weather, with the stove going and the lamps lit, and the evenings long enough for reading and conversation and chess, which Maria had learned from her father, and which she played with a combination of patience and surprise attacks that he found absolutely impossible to reliably defend against. He had not known she played chess before she found his battered set on the shelf in the main room in October. She had not mentioned it. She set it up with quiet efficiency, looked at him and said, "Do you play?" "Some," he said cautiously. She destroyed him in 22 moves and then explained every decision she had made while she made it, which was simultaneously educational and humbling. He got better over the winter. He never beat her. In February, William Barrett arrived. He came on a Wednesday afternoon, having written ahead in November, and then confirmed again in January, driving a rented wagon from Caldwell with a single trunk, and the expression of a young man trying to appear more certain than he was. He was 22, lean and brown-haired with some of Maria's quickness in his eyes, and he stepped down from the wagon and looked at his sister, and the particular quality of the light that came into both their faces when they saw each other was the kind of thing that closed a long chapter. They embraced on the ranch road, Maria's healed right arm, still sometimes aching in cold weather but functional, going around her brother's neck, and he bent over her because he was taller, and Stephen stood back a respectful distance and looked at the sky and gave them the moment. Then William straightened and looked at Stephen with the assessing look of a younger brother evaluating the man who had married his sister, and Stephen met the look steadily and offered his hand. William shook it. A short pause. Then William said, "She wrote to me about the garden. It's something." "It's her doing," Stephen said. William nodded once as if this confirmed something. "All right then," he said. He turned out to be an excellent ranch hand, quick to learn, strong, willing, with a good natural sense for cattle and a complete lack of vanity about hard work. He took up residence in the second room, which Stephen had been using as a storeroom, and which they cleared in a day, building William a proper bunk from lumber Stephen had seasoned and milled himself. He paid William fair wages, and William worked for them with an honest application that earned those wages fully. More than that, he became the third person in a household that expanded naturally to accommodate him, bringing his own humor and energy into the evenings, playing chess with Maria at a level that came close to challenging her, telling stories about Kansas City that made Stephen laugh and made Maria shake her head with older sister resignation. And it was William who, in March, noticed before Stephen did that Maria was not entirely well in the mornings. Stephen noticed it himself shortly after, or rather Maria told him directly one March morning when the winter was beginning to release its grip and the first tentative signs of spring were showing in the grass, sitting across the breakfast table with her hands around her coffee cup and a different kind of expression on her face, something between wonder and practicality, perfectly balanced. "I believe," she said, "that we should plan to visit Dr. Hayes in the next week or so." He looked at her. The wonder-practicality expression, the mornings, he understood. "Are you sure? Reasonably sure," she said. "Women generally are at a certain point." He was very still for a moment, in the way he went still when something important was happening and he wanted to be fully present for it. "How do you feel about it?" he asked carefully. She considered the question with honest thought. "I feel terrified," she said, "and I feel extraordinary." A pause, in approximately equal measure. He stood up from the table and came around and crouched down beside her chair so he was at her level and took both her hands in his and looked at her directly. "I will be here," he said, "every part of it." She looked at him with those dark, careful eyes that were not so careful anymore, or rather were careful in a completely different way than they had been when she stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell with a broken arm and a locked jaw, careful now the way something precious is careful, held close, kept safe. "I know," she said, and her voice was soft. "That is why I am more extraordinary than terrified." He kissed her hands. She leaned her forehead against his hair for a moment, and they stayed like that in the morning quiet of the kitchen, with spring trying to come through the window glass. Dr. Hayes confirmed it in the first week of April. He was pleased and careful and gave Maria thorough instructions about diet and rest and what to watch for, all of which she received with serious attention, and a list of questions that impressed him visibly. He said everything looked healthy and strong, and that she was, by his estimate, some 3 months along, which put the arrival sometime in early October. The spring of 1883 was a good one. The garden went in with full force, Maria directing and both Stephen and William providing labor, and the south garden expanded by a third that season, with a new section devoted to herbs and a long bed of sunflowers along the eastern fence that Maria said were for pleasure, and for the birds, and Stephen said, were the best idea anyone had had about that fence in 7 years. The morning sickness of the early months eased by May, and Maria moved through the pregnancy with the same practical, determined energy she brought to everything, refusing to be treated as fragile, only conceding specific limitations when the doctor outlined them as genuinely necessary rather than conventional caution. She rode Chester until July, when she decided with her own judgment that the movement was no longer comfortable, and switched to wagon travel without particular complaint. She and Clara Hicks had become close in the way that two strong-willed women who respected each other became close with mutual honest regard and frequent sharp exchange, and the kind of loyalty that did not require constant maintenance. Clara came over every 2 weeks or so, and they talked and worked and argued about specific gardening decisions, and occasionally about politics, which were Clara's particular interest, and Maria's right to have her own opinions on everything was one of the things Clara most openly admired about her. In June, a letter came from St. Louis that Maria read alone in the kitchen, and then came to find Stephen in the barn. She handed it to him without preamble, and he read it. It was from the matrimonial agency. It was to inform them, in the stilted formal language of the agency's correspondence, that one Douglas Crane had made inquiries with the agency regarding the whereabouts of Miss Maria Barrett, formerly of his employ. The agency had, as per their stated practice, provided no information and declined all further correspondence on the matter. They were informing Maria as a courtesy and as a matter of record. Stephen read it twice. He kept his face carefully even. He looked at Maria. She was standing in the barn doorway with the June light behind her, her hands at her sides, her expression composed in the way it composed itself around the things that cost her. "He is looking for me," she said. "The agency told him nothing," Stephen said. "I know, but he is looking." A pause. "He will not stop easily. He is not that sort of man." Stephen folded the letter neatly. "We will go to the sheriff," he said, "today. We will put it on record that this man is seeking you and that you have reason to believe him dangerous, and we will find out what legal remedy exists." She watched him. And if there is no legal remedy, the law is not always. She stopped. She was not naive. She knew very well what the law had and had not done for women in her situation. Then we know about it, he said steadily. And we are not surprised, and we handle what comes. He held her gaze. He is not going to walk into Kansas and take anything from you, not while I am breathing. She was quiet for a moment. I do not need you to fight my battles, she said. No, he agreed. But I would very much like to stand next to you while you fight them. Something shifted in her expression, the composure softening into something more real. All right, she said. They went to Caldwell that afternoon and spoke to Sheriff Eli Morrow, who was a solid, unflappable man of 55 with a long mustache and a way of listening that made you feel your words were going somewhere useful. He listened to the whole account, Maria told it, clearly and in detail, including the injuries Crane had inflicted, and he took notes in a careful hand and said that while the law's reach across state lines was limited in practical terms, the fact of the record mattered, and that if Crane ever appeared in his county he would be met with the full weight of what legal authority existed. He also, in a quiet aside to Stephen while Maria was speaking with the sheriff's deputy at the front desk, said that, in his experience, men like Crane rarely followed their obsessions all the way to Kansas because it required crossing the comfortable geography of their own power, but that it was right to be prepared. Stephen thanked him. He drove Maria back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and she was thoughtful and quiet most of the way, processing. He let her process. He kept the horses at a comfortable pace and watched the summer grassland going gold in the late sun. About 5 miles from home, she said, I am not going to be afraid of him. I know. I was afraid for too long. I'm not going back to it. You won't have to, she looked at him sideways. How are you so certain? He thought about this honestly. Because you are not the person you were when you worked for him, he said. And because this is not St. Louis, and because you have people here, he paused. And because I am not going anywhere. She reached across and put her left hand over his on the reins just for a moment, warm and firm, and then withdrew it and looked back at the road ahead. Douglas Crane never came to Kansas. Whatever inquiry he had made with the agency was apparently the limit of his reach or his determination, and the months passed without further communication or incident, and gradually that particular shadow receded to the periphery of things, not forgotten exactly, but no longer present in the way that a held breath is present. Maria let it go. Stephen watched her do it, not quickly, not all at once, but with the deliberate intention of a woman who had decided that the past had taken enough of her attention and that the present was too good to give away to it. Summer deepened and the baby grew, and the ranch prospered as much as a modest cattle operation could prosper in 1883, which meant not extravagantly but sustainably, with room for improvement and the solid foundation of well-managed land and livestock. William was proving to be a genuine asset. He had taken over primary management of the East pasture cattle and had a particular talent for identifying health issues in the herd early, which saved them twice that summer from losses that could have been significant. He had also, somewhere in the course of his settling in, begun making very regular rides into Caldwell on his days off, which had coincided precisely with the arrival of a new schoolteacher at the Medford School, a young woman named Ada Fletcher, who had been given temporary board in Caldwell at the Frontier House while the school was arranged. Ada was 20 years old, very forthright, with reddish-brown hair and a frank gaze that appeared to have no particular patience for nonsense, and William's usually fluid conversation had apparently become irregular and somewhat imprecise in her vicinity. Maria had noticed this with a sister's unerring eye and mentioned it to Stephen privately with an expression of fond exasperation. He turns into a different person around her, she said, a shorter, more confused version of himself. That sounds right, Stephen said. She seems very capable, Maria said, and she is clearly not indifferent to him, whatever she would prefer you to think. She was correct on all counts, as she generally was. In September, with Maria's condition very visible and the autumn beginning its gold and copper business with the Kansas landscape, Clara Hicks organized a modest gathering at Maria's house that she described as a practical visit, and which turned out to be, in everything but name, a baby celebration. Half a dozen ranch women from the area bringing gifts of soft blankets and small garments and practical supplies, and sitting in the main room and the kitchen, and talking with the easy warmth of a community that had quietly adopted Maria as one of its own over the past year and a half. Maria sat in the center of it with her healed right arm resting on the wide curve of her abdomen, and her eyes moving around the room taking in the faces of all these women who had shown up. And Stephen, watching from the kitchen doorway with a coffee cup in hand, could see clearly what it cost her not to cry, the effort of containing something very large and warm that was trying to come out. He thought about her in St. Louis alone, working for a man like Crane, with no family and no community and no safety net of any kind. He thought about the woman who had gotten on a stagecoach with a broken arm and a locked jaw and gone anyway. He thought she deserved every single warm thing that was currently in that room. The baby came on the 9th of October, 1883, which was a cool, clear morning with the first real frost edging the grass. Dr. Hayes arrived from Medford in good time, and Clara Hicks had been at the ranch since the previous evening, having apparently received some maternal communication about the timing that Stephen could not explain. William made himself useful by heating water and completely useless by pacing the length of the barn approximately 40 times in 3 hours. It was a long labor. Not dangerous, Dr. Hayes was calm and competent throughout, but long, and Maria worked through it with the precise focused determination she brought to everything, which Hayes told Stephen afterward was exactly the right kind of temperament for it, and which Stephen could have guessed. The baby was a boy. He was red and bawling and extremely loud for someone weighing approximately 8 pounds, and he had dark eyes, his mother's dark eyes, already looking at things with an expression of considerable interest in a face still crumpled from the effort of arriving. Stephen held him for the first time standing next to the bed where Maria lay exhausted and completely radiant, and the weight of him in his arms was the most real thing he had ever held. "Hello," he said to his son, which was an inadequate thing to say but the only one available. "His name," Maria said from the pillow, her voice rough with tiredness but entirely clear on this point, "is James." "James," Stephen agreed, trying it out, and the baby appeared to have no objections. "James Garrett." James for no particular famous person, Maria had said when they had discussed names during the long August evenings. Simply James because it was solid and not fashionable and would not embarrass a man. Stephen had agreed immediately because he had liked it too, and because in his experience Maria was generally right about most things. Clara held James while Stephen sat on the edge of the bed and took Maria's hand, and she leaned against him, and they looked at their son across the room, and there was nothing either of them had adequate words for, so they did not use words, only the warmth and presence of each other. "Are you all right?" he asked her quietly. "I am extraordinary," she said, which was what she had said about the pregnancy, and he remembered it, the equal measure of terrified and extraordinary. The terrified had been managed and the extraordinary had delivered. William came in from the barn approximately 2 minutes after the baby's arrival, which was how long it took someone to go and tell him it was over, and he held his nephew with the careful reverent terror of a young man who had never held an infant and whose hands were considerably larger than the situation seemed to call for, and his face had an expression on it that was entirely new, a softness that made him look very young. "He's very small," William said. "He is a perfectly normal size," Clara said firmly. "He looks like Maria," William said, and looked at his sister, and Maria smiled at him from the bed with a tiredness and warmth that was entirely maternal and entirely her. The year turned. James grew with the reliable enthusiasm of a healthy child in a house full of people who adored him, and the ranch continued its steady business around the fact of him, adapting to his presence in the way that households do, the rhythms shifting slightly to include the new small center of gravity. Maria was back on her feet within 2 weeks, which Clara said was both impressive and somewhat stubborn, and Stephen said nothing about it because Maria's opinion of her own capacity was generally more reliable than external estimates, and also because suggesting that she slow down was an excellent way to produce a very particular expression of patient contempt that he preferred to avoid. The spring garden of 1884 was the best yet. Maria had been planning it through the winter with the focused pleasure of someone who had found a real medium for their abilities, and the south garden now extended well past its original boundaries and included a proper herb section and 2 fruit trees she had coaxed along for 2 seasons, and the yield that summer was substantial enough that she began selling preserves and dried herbs at the Caldwell market twice monthly, which provided a modest supplemental income that she invested primarily back into the garden. William had proposed to Ada Fletcher in January. She had accepted with what William described as being completely calm about it, which was how Ada responded to most things, and which William had come to understand was her version of joy. The wedding was planned for June, and it was to be in Medford, where Ada taught, and the whole family from the Garrett ranch was going, including James, who was 8 months old and had opinions about wagon travel. The June wedding was lovely in the straightforward, practical way of frontier weddings, held in the small Medford church on a warm afternoon with the windows open to a breeze, and Ada in a pale dress she had made herself and William in his good suit looking, Maria said to Stephen afterward, like a man who could not believe his luck but was absolutely determined to deserve it. Stephen and Maria sat in the second pew with James on Stephen's knee, and the baby, as if understanding that he had a role to play, was completely quiet through the entire ceremony, which Maria called a miracle and Stephen called good character. At the reception afterward in the churchyard, while William and Ada accepted congratulations and James demonstrated his recently acquired ability to stand upright while holding onto Stephen's fingers with both hands, Maria stood next to Stephen and watched her brother and his wife and Clara and Dr. Hayes and the various Medford and Caldwell people assembled and said, "2 years ago I stepped off a stagecoach with a broken arm." "You did," he agreed. "I had nothing," she said. Not with bitterness, as a statement of fact from which she was measuring distance. "I mean that precisely. I had the clothes in my bag and enough money to get by for perhaps a month and a set of letters from a man I had never met. Those were reasonable letters," he said. "They were," she agreed with a sideways look. "You said you meant to build something lasting. I did mean it." "You have," she said. She looked at him directly, the dark eyes warm and steady and entirely open, no distance, no carefully managed wariness, just her looking at him the way she had looked at almost nothing else in the world except her son. "We have," she amended. He shifted James onto his hip, the baby immediately grabbing a fistful of Stephen's collar with decisive ownership, and he put his arm around Maria, and she leaned into him the way she did now, with the completeness of someone who had fully accepted belonging. "We have," he agreed. That fall the ranch took on its 3rd year of operation as a shared enterprise rather than a sole one, and the differences were visible in every aspect of it. The garden was the most obvious. The south side of the house, transformed from the weed-choked neglect he had shamefacedly shown her on their first drive out, into something tended and productive and beautiful in the specific way that a working kitchen garden was beautiful. The house itself had the quality that Clara had been right about, the thing that happened to a place when it was genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied. There was, too, a different quality in Stephen himself that he was not entirely able to perceive from the inside, but that people commented on in various ways. Pete Haskell said one afternoon at the Caldwell post office that Stephen looked like a man who had figured something out. Clara said more specifically and more accurately, during a visit in November, that he looked like a man who understood now what he had been building the land and the cattle and the house for all along, and that it had turned out to be bigger and better than the original plan. "She did that," Clara said, in her direct way. "We both did it," Stephen said, and Clara looked at him with a satisfaction that was as close to approval as Clara got. That evening he came in from the barn at dusk to find the kitchen lit warm and Maria at the stove with James on her hip, the smell of supper filling the house, and James reaching one determined small fist toward the wooden spoon Maria was using and being redirected with cheerful firmness. And the scene was so ordinarily perfect that he stood in the doorway for a moment just receiving it, the way you stood in sunlight and received warmth without anything more complicated than that. She heard him and looked over her shoulder, and the expression on her face when she saw him was immediate and warm, and James looked over too and said, "Duh," which was one of his 6 current words in his current preferred greeting for Stephen, and reached both arms toward him with urgent authority. Stephen came inside and took his son and kissed his wife and sat down at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and outside the Kansas plains were settling into their cold, dark immensity, and the stars were doing their extravagant business in the enormous sky, and the ranch that was theirs lay solid and right in all directions, and the house was full of warmth and coffee and the smell of supper, and the sound of a baby's running commentary on the world, and it was, Stephen Garrett thought, precisely what he had meant when he wrote "I mean to build something lasting." The winter of 1884 was gentler than the previous 2, which Maria said was the landscape offering an apology for the January blizzard, and Stephen said was just weather, and she said those 2 explanations were not mutually exclusive. William and Ada lived in a house on the edge of Medford, close to the school, and came out to the ranch most Sundays, and Ada had taken to the ranch with the pragmatic adaptability of someone who assessed what was real and made her peace with it. She and Maria had a friendship that worked on a different frequency than the Maria and Clara friendship, more even-toned, less combative, but genuine and steadily deepening. And on the Sundays when everyone was at the ranch table and James was passed from person to person, and the conversation went in 7 directions at once, Stephen would look around the table and feel the particular fullness of a life that had been built by good choices and a great deal of fortune. And one remarkable woman who had gotten on a stagecoach with a broken arm. In the spring of 1885, Maria told him one morning over coffee, with the same direct certainty she had used the first time, that they would need to visit Dr. Hayes again in the coming weeks. He looked at her across the breakfast table. The same wonder-practicality expression, slightly more practiced this time, the wonder perhaps outweighing the practicality by a fraction more than before. "Terrified and extraordinary?" he asked. "Mostly extraordinary this time," she said. He smiled. He stood and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her for a long moment in the kitchen morning light, and she put her hands against his chest, and he felt her breathing, steady and certain, and the ranch went on around them in its daily business, the cattle and the horses and the garden waiting for spring, and the road to Caldwell running southeast under the enormous Kansas sky, and 12 miles along it a town where a sign had once read "Miss Maria Barrett, welcome," in handwriting that was not particularly good, and a blue ribbon borrowed from the dry goods store. He had welcomed her. She had welcomed him right back, and then built something with him out of the welcome, something that was real and lasting and growing and entirely theirs. The second baby arrived in November, a girl this time, dark-haired and determined-looking from her very first moment in the world, and they named her Alina, and James received his new sister with the philosophical solemnity of a 2-year-old who has been told about this development in advance, and has processed it as well as a 2-year-old can, which is to say he regarded her with serious interest, and then attempted to share his wooden horse with her, which she could not yet hold, and accepted the deferral with some resignation. Ruth, the Indiana cousin, came to visit that December, arriving on the Caldwell stage with 2 children in tow and eyes that looked at everything with sharp, affectionate interest. She and Maria embraced on the front step of the ranch house, and both of them cried a little, and said nothing explanatory about it. And then Ruth looked at the house and the garden and Stephen standing at the fence holding James on his hip, and nodded in a satisfied way that communicated a long paragraph of relief and joy in a single gesture. She stayed for 3 weeks, which was the longest either of them had been in the same place since before Maria's scent. Louis years, and the house was wonderfully full, and the conversations in the evenings ran long and covered years of missed ground, and Stephen listened to Maria talk and laugh with her cousin in the particular register of deep familiarity that is its own kind of music, and was glad beyond his ability to adequately express. On Ruth's last evening, after the children were in bed and William and Ada had driven back to Medford and Clara had said her goodbyes, and the fire was banked low in the hearth, the 3 adults sat in the main room with the remnants of a late supper on the table, and Ruth looked at Stephen with the frank regard of a woman who loved Maria and wanted to be entirely certain about the things she was certain about. "She is happy," Ruth said, as if confirming something she had been watching for 3 weeks. "I know," he said. "She was not happy before for a long time." Ruth chose her words carefully. "She is very good at managing. She can make herself appear perfectly capable in circumstances that are destroying her. She did that for years and I could not get through it." She paused. "She is not managing now. This is the real thing." Stephen said, "Yes," because that was all that needed saying and he knew it was true. Ruth nodded. She looked at Maria, who had her eyes closed, leaning against Stephen's shoulder with Alina asleep against her chest, entirely unguarded, entirely present. "Good," Ruth said quietly, and the word held everything. The years settled into themselves the way good years did, not with the dramatic velocity of crisis and resolution, but with the steady accumulating richness of a life fully inhabited. James grew into a boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's precise intelligence, and a deep passion for the natural world that expressed itself in the collection of rocks, bones, and interesting seeds that appeared regularly in his pockets, and required periodic negotiation regarding what was appropriate to bring inside. Alina was fierce and funny, with her grandmother's gift for plants, according to Maria, and she would follow her mother through the garden from the moment she could walk, small hands patting soil with absorbed seriousness. The ranch expanded carefully over those years, not recklessly, but with the considered growth of an operation managed by people who understood land and animals and their own limits. Stephen built a larger barn in 1886 with William's help. Maria's garden produce became a regular feature at the Caldwell market, and her preserves had built a genuine reputation in the surrounding county, earning the ranch additional income that she tracked with meticulous care in a ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer. Dr. Hayes retired in 1887, and his replacement, a younger man named Dr. Clark, made the transition smoothly in part because Maria had organized a handwritten summary of all the relevant medical history of everyone on the ranch and in the immediate community, and presented it to him on his first week, which he received with stunned gratitude. Clara Hicks, who was now 58 and whose 2 sons had come back from their various adventures and settled near enough to visit regularly, remained the fixed star of the community's social geography, and her friendship with Maria had deepened over 5 years into the kind of bond that required very few words and held a great deal of weight. One autumn afternoon in 1887, Maria and Stephen were in the garden together, the children playing at the near end of the east pasture under William's occasional supervision, and the day was one of those October days that the plains did so well, gold and clear and enormous, and Maria was cutting the last of the season's herbs and he was turning over a garden bed, and they were talking easily about something ordinary, whether the shed needed a new roof before winter, some small decision about the ranch, and in the middle of the ordinary conversation she stopped and looked at him and said, "Do you remember what you wrote in your letter? The first letter?" He thought back. "I said I was not wealthy, but I was steady." Yes, she was holding a bundle of dried sage, its silver-gray color complementary to the autumn light. "You said you wanted a partner, not a servant. I remember." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had gone from careful and wary and held at a distance to warm and familiar and completely open across the years between. "You meant that," she said, "not as a question, as a recognition. I meant every word of it." She was quiet for a moment, turning the sage in her hands, and then she said, "I wrote back because of that sentence. Of all the letters I read through the agency, yours was the only one that used the word partner." A small pause. "I thought, this is either a man who understands something important or a man who knows what women want to hear. I decided to take the risk on it being the former." "And?" She looked at him with the whole of 5 years in her expression. "And you were exactly what you said you were," she said. "Every day. Steady and honest and entirely worth the risk." She smiled fully, the way she smiled that he had first seen in the garden 2 weeks after she arrived, the unguarded one. "I would like you to know that I am glad every single day that I got on that stagecoach." He put down the hoe and walked to her across the turned garden earth and cupped her face in his rough hands and kissed her in the October afternoon light, gently and thoroughly, the way you kissed someone you intended to go on kissing for the rest of your life. "I am glad you got on it too," he said. "Every single day." She laughed against his mouth, the low, warm laugh that had been doing irreversible things to him since the first time he heard it in this same garden 5 years before, and she put her arms around him with the sage still in her hand, and the garden smelled of autumn and dried herbs, and the children's voices came floating up from the pasture on the light October wind, and the house stood solid and warm behind them. And the sky was the particular impossible blue that the Kansas plains produced on the best days of October, and everything in Stephen Garrett's life was precisely, completely, irreversibly right. They walked back to the house together in the late afternoon, her hand in his, and she told him she was thinking about expanding the herb garden next spring to include medicinal plants. She had been reading about it, and he said he would build her the additional bed over the winter, and they argued pleasantly about the optimal placement all the way to the front door. Inside, Eleanor had fallen asleep on the parlor rug with a small blanket pulled up around her by James, who was sitting nearby with unusual stillness, reading the primer that Ada had given him, one finger tracing the words with careful deliberation. He looked up when they came in and said, "Pa, what does pioneer mean?" Because he had encountered the word and considered it worth asking about. Stephen looked at his son, 7 years old with gray eyes and a serious face, and then at Maria standing beside him with autumn color in her cheeks and dried sage in her hand, and he thought about the word. Pioneer. Someone who goes first into unknown territory. Someone who stakes their claim in the open country and builds from whatever they brought with them. "It means someone brave enough to go somewhere new," he said, "and make it home." James considered this with the full weight of a 7-year-old's philosophical machinery, and then nodded once, satisfied, and went back to his reading. Maria put the sage on the kitchen table and came back and stood in the parlor doorway and looked at her family in the lamplight. And the expression on her face was the one Stephen had no words for and had never tried to name, because some things were more real than names. The deep, quiet certainty of a woman who had survived hard country, inside and out, and come through it to this. A room full of warmth, a husband who meant what he said, children with good eyes, and a life that was entirely, irrevocably hers. She had arrived with a broken arm and a locked jaw and the bone-deep courage of someone who refused to be stopped, and she had told him everything, not all at once but over time, in the way that trust was built carefully, honestly, piece by piece, until there was nothing held back and nothing that needed to be, and what remained between them was the simplest and most complete thing in the world. He came and stood beside her in the doorway, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched their children in the warm lamplight. And outside the last of the day was going gold and deep over the Kansas grassland, and the ranch was quiet and full, and they were home.